You want to kick it off?
Yeah, I've got something to kick us off. How much does a red lightsaber cost?
Something half off.
An arm and a leg.
Oh.
An arm and a leg.
I was so close.
Yeah, you were. It was pretty close. It was pretty close. Okay, so the reason I asked about red lightsabers is, do you remember in the super infamous throne room fight in The Last Jedi, where Rey and Kylo will like fight a bunch of red dudes? There's this moment toward the end where like Kylo is he's like stuck, he's trapped, he's like pinned, and he can't escape. And Rey like tosses her saber to him, and he ignites it through this dude's head.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the gnarliest shit I've ever seen in a Star Wars property. And I was like, yo, what? You could just do that? Like Disney could just they could just be like, yeah, this guy, he just aces this dude by turning it on through the head. And I'm so fascinated by that. And I have not stopped thinking about it since I saw it. What do you think about, first of all, what do you think about this fight scene before we get into the specific saber toss? I know it's like got a lot of controversy. Give me the because I've got no idea. I just know that people hate it and then some people think it's great. What's your take? What do you think?
I will say that when I saw this, not just the movie, but obviously that fight scene is one of the most initially visually pleasing things that you're going to see in a Star Wars film, and that's what they made it for. They obviously did not make it to be able to be dissected whatsoever, because there are tons of videos that go through and break it down blow by blow, and it is one of the worst choreographed fight scenes that many people have ever seen. The people that actually like do that kind of stuff, professionally.
For whatever reason, it's so dumb, and she could just extend it and kill him so easily. So she could have done this at any point up until now. I can't think of any exchange as bad as the exchange we just witnessed, because the level of stupid in every position was astounding.
Oh God, I hate this. If you watch them, in between each move, the stunt guys, who I'm sure are phenomenal and probably super on it, realize Daisy and Kylo Ren there are late. So every time they spin backwards into their move, they're just pausing in their little pose and waiting for them to be ready and then coming in and attacking on time.
But from a visual perspective, it is absolutely
so cool
gorgeous. Yeah, and I was blown away when I saw it in theaters the first time. And then there's the controversy we're talking about with the disappearing dagger, and Rey definitely supposed to have been injured twice during the course of that battle there. And then
I have a theory about that. If you would like my hot Star Wars theory for this conversation.
Yeah.
So Rian Johnson apparently shot most of the scenes that he wanted and kind of put together his rough cut. So like usually the way that the way that Hollywood movies work, for people that sort of aren't super into the process, basically you kind of end up with this like really rough cut where it's not even like blocked by camera shots necessarily, but you sort of have your rough like, okay, this is vaguely the runtime, here is the scene changes, here is like the rough content we're going to include, and then usually you'll have like some penciled in effects, like if there's any sort of particularly big special effects, you'll have some previs of that in the reel as well, and you'll sit down and you'll kind of watch that through. Now, typically what happens in a normal film is then the director goes, okay, they'll sit down with their editors and they'll go like, okay, well, how do we think we can best keep the pacing in this scene, or do this transitional edit, or whatever the thing is. Apparently what happens with Star Wars is Disney go, interesting. You got to cut that. You got to change this. We're not going to use that. You can't do that. We don't like that. So my theory, and this is like it's deep on the Reddits. You can go and find it deep on the Reddits, is that this scene originally played out differently. And you're right that Rey gets injured, and that final moment where she throws the saber is a complete reshoot, and it's supposed to end some other way. There's supposed to be some other outcome here. The theory would be, if we were really doing Star Wars and doing it good, Rey would lose a hand probably, which would like set us up for the final film, and that would rhyme with the Return of the Jedi kind of coming into that film, or vice versa. Kylo loses a hand, whatever that scenario would be, you try and rhyme it with the previous ones. Instead, it seems like Disney probably like jumped in and they were like, no, you can't stab Rey twice and have her be injured. This is not going to work. You can't do that. Whatever that is. It seems like they changed something. is my kind of hot take.
Yeah, and whether that's because it's the sort of like opposite take of the equality of idea of feminism, and it's like you can't have the female being badly injured on film because she's the ideal that's held up and she's always perfect and all that kind of stuff. Or it could be at the same time that based on where you see the daggers supposedly going through her, one like guts her across the stomach and then the other one goes right up through her back and like definitely through a lung. So it would have been like brutal, like either Kylo like heals her with the Force or she maybe dies, kind of like that kind of damage. So I can see
you could just stuff her in a Bacta tank for like a few months.
Well, I mean that's a Star Wars thing too, so that wouldn't have been the worst thing aside from the fact that would again be them like diminishing their what they were aiming for with the pure, heroine figure.
But like that would be so interesting because you take Rey off the board for a few months or whatever while she's recovering, and suddenly they're in an even worse situation, right? The Resistance, they're down their best warrior. They don't have their space wizard anymore. She's recovering. They need to stay alive long enough for her to recover, which instead it ends up being, I think Finn in the next film for some reason ends up in that position. So you can see potentially like how they've had to change the scripts to kind of fit these changes that Disney have enforced. But the reason I'm interested in this particular moment is it's the first time in the sort of in Star Wars writ large that we've seen the lightsabers used as lightsabers rather than swords. Yeah. And what I mean by that is in Lucas's imaginary, these are not lightsabers. He calls, a bit like me, the fucking... I always talk about them as like laser swords because they are laser swords. That's how George deploys them, is a sword, right? He doesn't view them as, they're not a sci-fi weapon. The fact that they ignite and turn off is not a factor for him. They are just a sword, right? Whenever we see them used in the prequels and the original trilogy, literally just swords. What's interesting about the sequel trilogy, this kind of starts with a little bit in, what's the sixth one called? Hope's back, baby. Star Wars Hope's here again. What's it called?
Six would be Return of the Jedi.
No, what's it called? No, not 6. Sorry, 7. A New Hope's the original one. Hope Return. No, fuck. Hang on, I'll get it. The Force Awakens. Okay.
It was funnier to see what you were coming up with.
I don't know. I wanted Hope to. It should have had Hope in the title. Anyway, I don't know what just happened to my brain. But yeah, so like it's the first time. Hope Returns is such a stupid title. Okay, so in the sequel trilogy, they're actually like they become a sci-fi weapon, right? So like when Rey picks it up out of that chest in Maz Kanata's basement, it's imbued with Force memories of Luke or whatever. And this is the first time we see a lightsaber used as like its sci-fi functionality, which is you can turn it on, and that's actually a maneuver that would do damage. Like it's a function of that sci-fi tool versus it just being a sword. And this, like, I find this really interesting as a genre change, right? Because Star Wars previously was really fantasy. It's sort of high fantasy in the prequels, and then kind of your low spaghetti western fantasy in your original trilogy. And this is where it becomes like actual sci-fi. And you see that in the last film as well, but there's a real interest in the mechanisms of the Force and the tools that they're using. And it becomes really bedded down in like, can somebody be cloned and come back to life? What is Force doing? How can you extract Force energy? What are Force ghosts? Like it suddenly starts to raise all of these sci-fi questions that fantasy does not deal with. And I think that genre transition is what makes this film so jarring in a lot of places. And this exact moment is where I went, oh shit, this is like genuinely just sci-fi now. Because that igniting of the saber is like, you can't, like, we've never seen that. We've never seen people use these weapons in these particular ways in the core films. Obviously, like, in Legends and Clone Wars and stuff, it's a bit different. I'll talk about Legends in a minute. But I find that transitionary point, and this is a really explicit moment of it, fascinating. Because then, as the movie goes on, we just get further and further into the sci-fi, where you have, like, Luke doing his Force Ghost projection and all that crazy stuff. So it's almost like this kind of... it's like, it was a balancing point, and then this is the kind of off the cliff moment where you sort of delve fully into that. And I just find that really fascinating.
So I had two interesting points. One is about like the EU and the novels, and then the other one is about fan films. And I have been a like huge fan of watching fan-made Star Wars material, and especially like lightsaber fights. Like it's a huge thing in the Star Wars community to have a lightsaber choreograph like competitions. They have those every year, and they're on like 23 or something like that, of having this lightsaber choreograph competition. And those things are amazing to watch because, just like you described, the people involved are learning over the years to treat them not as general swords, but as sci-fi weapons. So there are all kinds of, like, my favorite fights are the ones where they do that specifically. Like there's one of Ryan Weber, Ryan versus Dorkman. It's RVD2, where he's dragging his saber across the floor, which is obviously melting the floor underneath him. And then he uses that to throw the sparks up into the other guy's face. So he's using his saber to melt the steel and throw the molten stuff into the other dude's face. Like, you never see stuff like that. And then,
Right.
And then, just like we saw, like they'll when they're clashing, they'll turn off the blade so the other guy goes completely through them, expecting to hit, because you can't turn off a sword blade. So everyone is cued in to think they're going to clash, and then he turns off his saber, the other guy goes through him, he pops it back on, and now it's inside the other guy. So there's all kinds of really interesting things that you could do.
So interesting.
But with the novels, it's interesting that they knew that from the very beginning, because I remember reading, and I think it was the old Sith novels, when they talked about the training that Bane went through, and they were describing that one of the first things that they learned to do was to build a force field around themselves, because at any point during the fight, their enemy can use the force to physically turn off their lightsaber, because it's just a tiny button. So the first thing that they had to learn to do was to control the force to prevent their enemy from just turning off their weapon. And when you look at it like that, I mean, that is such a defenseless weapon to use when a tiny button just makes it go away, you know?
But okay. However, let me counter argue that with some interesting thoughts that I have on this, because yes, you're right. It is like a really like delicate, like if someone pushes that button, your goose is cooked, right? You're gonna get aced. But theoretically, that's why lightsabers are primarily used by Force users. It's because they have a certain level of precognition of predicting what their opponent's going to do, that whilst a lot of those things, yes, ring true of like, it is this kind of, you're on a knife's edge at all time with this tool, you're also, like, a lot of those gambits that you would expect to work wouldn't work because the other person would always see them coming. And so, and there's, and this is where I think Legends gets really interesting. Obi-Wan, when he's talking about lightsaber fighting and his experience and his study of like sort of ancient forms, he talks a lot about how much concentration it takes to be always trying to precognitively, anticipate what your opponent's going to do in a fight. And that's why in a lot of the fights that we see in the films, and then particularly in the cartoons as well, it seems like they're not trying to hit each other a lot of the time. And that's because they're trying to predict the next few moves to try and identify an opening where they could go for lethality. And so a lot of the criticism you see is that people being like, lightsaber fights are really dumb. They never actually try to hurt each other. It's like, yeah, but these motherfuckers are space wizards trying to like predict when an opening could be appropriate, because, every single move is theoretically one that could get you killed. And so I guess then what I'm interested in is this moment proves that Kylo is thinking about this tool differently than he would be if he was fighting Rey, right? He knows he's just fighting some regular ass dudes. These guys aren't force sensitive at all. Rey is the same when she's fighting them. They actually fight really differently here than when they actually clash in the following film. It's sloppier. They're just like doing these big baseball bat swings and shit. They're stabbing and stuff like that because they don't need to worry about these people being precogs. So the actual fight style changes. And it's something that Obi-Wan talks about a lot when you're fighting non-Force users is you can afford to change up the kind of style that you use. And so I find that interesting of, there are so many different compelling arguments that track in universe, right? Sort of within the context of Star Wars as to why you might fight one way or why you might fight the other way. And you can actually justify it within the fiction. Like somebody could be like, yeah, well, I think that, the Tricata style, which is where you you turn the lightsaber off and on during a fight to throw off your opponent's balance and stuff like that. One could argue in the fiction, well, the Trikata style is obviously really more powerful because Jedi are never expecting it, or, the other fighters never expecting it. Then someone else might argue that like more classical forms are better because they're better suited to that kind of mode of precognitive reading and stuff like that. So it's kind of what I love about, this is what I find really engaging with Star Wars as fiction, is this one moment kind of extrapolates to so many different people being able to actually lobby kind of not just like arguments of I think fight is good or bad, but arguments of like, well, why could they have been fighting that way? What could the characters' motivation have been there? What is the story trying to tell us about the way that these two are approaching that fight and the way that Kylo's approaching that moment? And that's why I think, even though I don't love the specifics of a fight, obviously the visuals are really cool. It tells you so much about Kylo and his sort of comprehension of this moment from that single like decision. And it's hard to tell if it's Rey's decision as well, because when
that's
she
what I was about to say.
Saber,
is that the fact that she is the one that comes up with the plan, and he has no choice but to either catch the saber or get thwacked in the face with the saber. So
Boosh, like right in the noggin.
Right, but the idea, whether or not this makes sense to the story or not, because she is not like, she's held a lightsaber for all of a couple hours maybe, right?
Yeah.
At this point, and somehow she, either because it's new to her so she didn't have to relearn how swords work or whatever, but she intuitively knows, hey, I could turn off the blade portion, chunk it at him, and then he can turn it back on. I feel like a lot of characters would never actually make that realization, whether or not it makes sense for her character, or it does because she's new and it wouldn't make sense to an established Jedi.
That's a really good point. Yeah, because an established Jedi wouldn't think to do that because they have so much more training. They would see so many more options. She's very literal at this point.
Which ironically is,
yeah,
like I love studying fighting stuff, and it's the one person that is most dangerous for you to fight is an amateur, because they haven't had the training, they don't know what you're supposed to do, and they'll do really stupid stuff, and it actually works and gets the other person killed. But
they don't know the meta, man.
Yeah,
they don't know the lightsaber meta. They're just out here like doing all kinds of weird shit in ranked matches and killing everybody, and everybody's like, what the, you shouldn't, what? Like, it is that level of like, and that's kind of what makes her dangerous, right, in this movie. Okay, tell me this then, because you know way more about Star Wars than I do. In the next movie, we get, Rey does like a bit of like sweet training. I know it's all like a week or whatever, but there is an extent to which her combat training with a staff kind of translates to this style of sword fighting which she practices, which is real like kind of big baseball bat swings, blocks, and kind of stabby stabs, right? What's your take on? There's this moment slightly before then that's just popped up on my other monitor where she's sort of got her blade up like this and she's blocking, and or I think it's like, how is it? Yeah, okay, so she's got it reversed like that, and she's blocking up here, and she drops the saber and then catches it in her other hand and kind of does a backwards kind of like cut across this guy's chest. Now that maneuver is something that I think she's done with the spear in the first film. Like, it's like a thing you can imagine doing with other weapons, right? It's a reversal. You shouldn't do it, by the way. Don't drop your weapon in a fight. Bad idea. Because if you don't catch that, you are dead. Like,
it's interesting is we need to pull in the Winter Soldier really quick, because I could point exactly to a clip where he does literally that same thing, and apparently it's something that like actual fighters will practice, because if your one hand is tied up just like that, they have to know they could drop from one hand to another and then immediately gut the guy. And Damn. Winter Soldier has a brilliant knife fight where we see him swapping back and forth between his two hands.
That knife fight is crazy cool.
Yeah.
By the way,
and it's also interesting that move is something I'm pretty sure that it's Mara Jade that we see it described that she pulls that in a fight in the Thrawn trilogy in those novels, and it talks about how long it took her so many dozen hours to perfect that technique, but it's so important to have because it always catches people by surprise. But again, it's back to the idea of, is Rey really that intuitive that she would have thought, oh, this could happen? Because obviously from the way it was filmed, it was a purely intuitive thing. It wasn't a trained, taught thing.
But I kind of like that for Rey's character on some level, and I know that the sort of the way that that final film ends up handling her is pretty. It's bad. That film is badly written, and as a result, it makes her arc come across a particular way. But her just being like this kind of beast of instinct is really interesting as a kind of as a foil for Kylo Ren, who is this kid taking on the imagined. He's taking on the imaginary heirs of Darth Vader. He's trying to become a new version of this kind of larger than life figure. And so a lot of what he's doing is emulating other behavior. And you have on the other end of the spectrum, we have Rey, who is like going purely on instinct, like purely on her sort of hard won lessons, trying to stay alive on this scrap planet, plus sort of her intuitive connection to the Force. And those two foils, I think, play off each other really well in this fight, because you see Kylo kind of, like, when Kylo fights, he goes straight beast mode. He's like, I'm gonna just cut these fools down. He goes for the Darth Vader style of combat, which is you use your precog ability and you just strike very precisely, right? You're kind of going these big hits. And Darth Vader does that because obviously his mechanicals aren't that fast. I think with Kylo, it's interesting because then in moments like this, you kind of go, man, if he practiced a different style and was a bit more agile, he would not get into half of the danger he does in this fight. And I think that is interesting as a storytelling kind of comparison, where Rey is able to kind of handle herself a lot more nimbly in this moment and deal with more guys at once, whereas Kylo several times in this fight gets his arms bound or gets in a situation where he has to quickly duck out of the way. Rey's doing a lot more proactive fighting, which makes complete sense to me because of the way that their kind of characters are positioned. Yeah, you're right. There's something interesting about her intuitive ability to just kind of get what to do with this weapon. But also, I think I don't know, I'm not sure if the criticism that some people lobby against her, which is that, well, how does she know how to do all this? I don't know if that makes any sense. If you spend like a week kind of thinking about this weapon, you're going to think about a lot of this stuff. And if you have a good connection to the Force, chances are you can execute on it. Like, it's not that insane. It's not like other techniques where if Rey did like, I can't remember what the block technique is called, but Anakin's like behind the back block that like nobody else does. If she did that, I'd be like, what the fuck? Like, that's bullshit. You can't just like intuit an actual saber style. But she's not like intuiting styles. She's intuiting like specific moves that make sense. And I think there's a meaningful distinction in a storytelling capacity.
Well, there's also
that makes sense.
There's also this distinction that a lot of the audience members don't really know how to identify or don't know what it actually looks like to see someone who is truly a natural in something. And that very much is what they were trying to depict with Rey, at least assuming that they weren't going with the she was trained and then she lost her memories kind of thing, which people were hypothesizing at the beginning. Yeah, so
sorry?
Yeah, so that was a big theory when episode 7 came out, and she knew how to do everything, but she had no memory of anything. So one of the theories was that she was one of the students that Luke trained along with Kylo, and they were like peers. And then in order to protect her, once Kylo turned evil, killed all the rest of the students, Luke erased her memory and then dumped her on a planet away from everyone so that she would be safe. So that was a theory from a while back. Yeah. I mean, ironically, it would explain why she was so OP. Because everyone wants you to have that training. For the most part, people don't like you are naturally the most powerful thing ever. Like, there's one Saitama. Like there's
unless it's your OC where you're like, actually, he's the best sword fighter and he was just born that way. And he's got signature blasters and his lightsaber is actually a completely different kyber crystal from everybody else's. And he's got a force technique no one else can do. It's like, if it's your OC, you're fine with it for some reason, but if it's a character that somebody else writes and it's a woman, then it's game over, Red Rover,
But something else that I thought a while back when you were talking was interesting was just the audience's perception of what's happening. And when you were talking about specifically with episode 1, how people critique, they're not even trying to hit each other. They're just aiming for each other's lightsabers. And again, that goes back to the fact that so many audience members don't actually study hand-to-hand combat and don't know what you would actually do in that situation. Like, a lot of the time, you literally are trying to knock their saber away. Like, And that's something I want to make a video on one day, is showing like why a bow staff is so powerful, because like half the point of it is that I could use the leverage with my bow staff to knock a sword so hard it will fly 30 feet away from you. Like, you have that much power with your blows. So I don't care about hitting the person. I'm going to knock his weapon across the room. And that's half the point.
Because then I can do what I want.
Yeah.
Which we see, which you see multiple times. And that sword fight between Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, and Darth Maul, the thing that you raise a really interesting point there, which is a lot of what they're doing is they are maneuvering their blades and then physically kicking each other back the second that they realize there's an opening about to happen. And it happens like a dozen times in that fight where, well, not a dozen literally, but you know what I mean? Where like, Obi-Wan will be like about to create an opening that would let Qui-Gon get in and get a killing blow. And Darth Maul will just like, not even using his saber, will just kick him the fuck away. Like, just force kick that motherfucker, get him out of here. Mm-hmm. And it's such a like, it happens a few times and Qui-Gon does it to Darth Maul as well. And it's an interesting dynamic that I think kind of matriculates upwards through what we understand sword fighting to be, because like that is such a like, I'm anticipating the next few seconds and I see where this is going. I need to hit the release lever. Like, I need to get out of this somehow, and I know that my sword is in a position not to do it. What's available to me? I can punch or I can kick.
And like I said, like the interesting thing is people not realizing how realistic some of that stuff is. Because there was one self-defense class I was taking where they made us pit two people versus one, because like if you get mugged, it's a lot of the time going to be multiple people coming at you. So the trainer was like, I want you to see what it's going to be like. If you got two guys coming at you, what do you do? How are you physically going to handle it? And that's never happened to me. That was a one-time thing that I've ever had this experience. And within a few seconds, I realized that I have no chance unless I am circling around one guy, completely eliminating the other one, which is like just what MAUL was trying to do. He was trying to make Obi and Qui-Gon get in the way of each other, because having both of them come at him from opposite sides is something you can barely defend against. But if you get one tripping against the other person and you're kind of circling around them, it's just really interesting. And to bring it back to that fight scene, we don't really see too much of that with Kylo kind of just brute forces he's the one that has the most multiple opponents, and Rey's always just fighting one guy.
What's interesting is that, and looking at it now, the way that Rey kind of deals with it is she's very much like, she doesn't actively separate them. She just happens to get a lucky blow in early. Whereas Kylo's dealing with three guys in like the most like, holy fuck, I'm about to die type maneuvers ever. Like, he is on the ropes at all times, but he pulls through, I guess, sort of, like you say, brute force, and I guess, whatever training he's got. But there's an interesting aspect of that fight is so different. That episode 1 fight is so different because it's two Force users versus a Sith with this particular style of weapon. These are three fighters at the peak of their ability as well. Like, keep in mind, like, this is like, they are all at the peak of their power. They're at the peak of their physicality. I mean, I suppose Obi-Wan really, like, a few years later, but they're all pretty close to being in like tip-top shape for this. And they're all precogs. They're all Force users. What's interesting about this is when Kylo gets surrounded, he immediately is like, okay, how do I get somebody out of the picture as soon as possible? He's not doing what we see in that fight in episode 1, which is, how do I separate them in order to create an opening? He's like, I just need to get people out. I need to get them down. Like, he is going for killing blows every single time. And
that almost panic that you described, that's like in his eyes, like that actually makes sense for his character, which I've heard a lot of people talk about before, that theoretically in this world, he would not have had a lot of lightsaber fighting training unless it was just him and Luke. But given his age when he turned evil and left everything, I mean, maybe he hasn't had that much practice. So
unless he like started as a youngling or whatever, which like it doesn't seem like he did. Yeah. And like also it's been a few years, right? He hasn't actually had a sword fight in a long time, except for Rey in the snow, and that was, he was injured and it was really brief.
And so you can't really picture Snoke like picking up a saber and like trying to teach him anything. I mean,
I was just imagining like, that would never happen. Also, I'm trying to imagine like Kylo Ren in his quarters, like with like a combat droid or something doing practice. That guy is not practicing ever. Like he's the kid that like is learning guitar or whatever and does not do his weekly chords. Like he is absolutely not that guy.
Which is that's an interesting comparison when you were talking about Qui-Gon and Darth Maul, because Maul was, I don't know how much of that was written before, Lucas made the film, but Maul was supposed to be an assassin trained from birth to be the deadliest warrior that he could possibly be. Qui-Gon was so powerful a Jedi that he should have been one of the 10 Grand Masters. That's his status. He was supposed to be extremely powerful. And Obi-Wan, likewise, even though he was still very young, was a very, very promising Jedi. So the expertise that you're seeing in that first fight, people also underestimate how high that level of expertise actually was. And then the comparison that we're getting now with the style that Kylo and Rey and the guards are fighting with, which is interesting. If you look at their moves and everything, the fluidity of everything, the Red Guards actually look more practiced. They look like they are the professionals, and Rey and Kylo are kind of just winging it.
They're making it up as they go. Yeah, these guys have like specific moves. Like one of them sees Rey do something and then he's like, okay, that's her style, and he breaks his weapon in two and uses it as two because he sees that's going to get him a better advantage. They have practice techniques. Like one of them like wraps his what do you call it? Like the whip around Rey's sword. Like they have things they're doing that are like clearly like they're practicing that in bad guy training like every week. Like they're running drills every week to do that, versus these guys who are just making shit up as they go.
And probably because they're actually stunt people, the footwork is something that once you know what you're looking for, the footwork is really obvious. That for the most part, they are maintaining a very solid foundation when they're moving around. And there are several times where you can see Rey like almost fall down, or Kylo almost good when they're flipping around and stuff.
Yeah, she's very unbalanced, and I kind of love that for her. I love this idea that like she has no clue what she's doing and is just, it's like it's literally what Snoke says before they start fighting, which is like she is just operating purely off of like this like impetus to resist. Like she is just resisting things, right? She's resisting the desert to try and stay alive. She's resisting the First Order. She's resisting death in this moment. She's just operating on this like instinctual level of defense of like, I need to keep myself alive. There is very little about Rey that isn't completely fueled by that until sort of the kind of next part of the story. I mean, they don't even really get that right, because you can see her arc, right? Which is like her learning that, there are things that are beyond you defending yourself and keeping yourself alive and defense. Like you can let people in, and you can let kind of that passion direct you in other directions, and you can take control of that stuff. But there's an interesting sort of through line here of her being that scrappy and always like nearly falling over. And there's actually a moment that just flashed on my other screen where you can tell that they clearly did a take where she absolutely fell over trying to do this move, because it's like she's got both feet she's got like both feet kind of doing a sort of stuck together, and then in the next cut she's moved them slightly. I'm just trying to imagine like Daisy Ridley trying to do a spin move and then just going on the mat. Rian Johnson being like, oh my god, can we do that again? Can we do that again?
I was planning to teach her this whole routine in 3 days, but she surprisingly learned everything in an hour and a half.
Which is, it's interesting to think about, because the idea that she is doing all of this instinctually makes a whole lot of sense, but A, I don't know if that's 100% what they were going for, and B, they definitely did not depict that in the best way. And I think so much of what we're talking about was purely just bad choreography and not enough practice from the people involved in it. Because I want to say that they filmed that entire thing in like a couple days, if I remember like the behind the scenes thing properly.
I mean, the whole sequel trilogy was relatively rushed anyway because of the kind of decisions that they made at a production level, as far as like moving directors around and things like that. This is what I meant. So you make a really interesting point here, which is like this clearly feels put together in a way that like it lacks a sense of cohesion, in no small part because of the way that they reshot some of the moments in this fight scene and then just reshoot the whole thing. But And that's where I'm like, this is where I think Rian Johnson and then potentially Trevorrow's following script would have been a really interesting kind of ending to the story, because the way that this fight avoids being risky, like we said before, in not injuring Rey and not taking her off the board for a while, or not injuring Kylo and taking him off the board for a while, this feels like the moment where you do that in the narrative, where you'd be like, okay, the Resistance are going to get trapped in the next little bit here, because this is the same movie where the Resistance gets stuck in that big bunker, and then Kylo has that sword fight with Luke. That's this film, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I'm pretty sure like every time I open my mouth, I'm just like upsetting Star Wars fans everywhere. I promise I know these movies. But they look similar, okay? They're both like bearded guys with a blue sword. I don't know what you want from me. But,
yeah, the Star Wars universe is not at all homogenous, right?
No, exactly right. But there's an element to which I find it really compelling that if you had taken one of them off the board here, that plays out a lot more consistently. That kind of moment where the Resistance is trapped is a lot more threatening because you've lost like your best sword fighter. They have to find another way to make Rey not there for that to have tension. But imagine instead she's in a fucking Bacta tank or something and they're out of options and they don't know what to do. That's also equally compelling. But I guess writ large, this moment where the saber gets ignited from that throw and Rey doing that it signals a lot in the sensibilities of what is going to change moving forward, of what these movies are going to become, which, like we said, is going to move into that sci-fi space. It's going to move into different genre conventions. And all of that stuff kind of cascades and kind of combines to, I think, a reason a lot of people find this dissatisfying in some sense is not because the individual moment is bad, but the larger context and the implications of it and what it ends up doing to that final film, particularly given they don't go down Trevorrow's original script, which, you know, was a lot more interesting in the way that it took risks with Rey. There is an extent to which I kind of get why people don't like this, but also I think it's really effective in what it's trying to do, which is signal that transition and that change and be like, hey, this is going to be, we're doing stuff differently here. We're trying to communicate different stuff. Also, on a scene level, it means that when the fight ends, Rey doesn't have a weapon, right? That's the other thing that happens here, is that she is now at Kylo's mercy to an extent. I mean, she could just force grab his lightsaber, which, by the way, why didn't we get like a fucking sick, like, Rey the Kylo fight right here? How cool would that? I understand that like narratively it wouldn't have, it's like paced poorly, but that would have been rad as hell. Like, give me just like a real good, like, let them go at each other. Let's see them fight again. Let's chop off someone's hand. Like, let's just do it. Like, let's just go in. Let's just do the rhyming properly. But I bet you Disney were like, no, we don't want to, we can't do that. We can't have a robot hand. We can't have, and also like you can't have Kylo have a robot hand because he already wears gloves. So you couldn't sell a different toy is the other thing.
Well, think about it though, because if they did all of this, like if she was supposed to be initially really badly hurt, then she would not have had that whole, you know, little speech that she and Kylo had. You know, you were nothing, you came from nothing. That whole thing would have been completely different. So they had to refilm all of that dialogue, and they could never have choreographed a new compelling fight scene in the time that it takes to do reshoots and have it actually pulled off and look good.
That's a good point.
And another really interesting thing that I just realized was this whole thing was about this whole thing about this one scene started off with the idea that the lightsaber is being used as truly a sci-fi weapon for the first time, but that wasn't the first time that we saw it. The first time we saw that was with Snoke when Kylo killed him. He used the Force to turn it sideways, flicked it on.
Oh yeah.
And then pulled it with the Force through the dude.
Which is gnarly as hell, by the way.
It was yeah.
It's a move.
Yeah. Like I was blown away, and I did not see it coming. I was like, there's no way this is gonna happen. I cannot state how much I was blown away by this movie the first time I saw it, which makes going back and realizing all of the holes just kind of hurts me because I loved it at first so much.
The funniest thing was when we first saw it, and if you want to, you can go back to my old podcast Arthritis and listen to our reaction the night of. We went to the press screener, and press screeners are always interesting for stuff like this because it's half journalists like us, and then it's half just like people that like have won like a radio competition or who are like diehard fans who are like part of some club or something. So it's a really interesting mix where you have half of the people who are just like taking notes and stuff, and then half of the people who are like gasping and cheering and stuff. It's always a weird vibe. And that moment where Snoke gets got, I remember like turning to Laura and being like, what the fuck? Did they just get my guy like that? They just do him like that. He's dead? She's like, holy fuck, they just did him like that. And literally everyone in the cinema was like, they did him like that? Yo! Like everybody was losing their mind. Like, I think just in those movies, you just don't see wild shit like that often enough. Like we're not prepared for it. It's a bit like the when you go into I was a bit like the end of Infinity War when it just like cuts to credits, and you could see all of the other journalists be like, hang on, what? How's at the end of the movie? Because it's not called part one, right? So like for a lot of them who are just like regular writers for like a newspaper or something, they're not invested in Marvel stuff. They're just there to write a review for the local paper or whatever. They don't have that like context going into it, and so it's really effective for them. Equally in this moment, I was like, what the like how what's gonna happen next? And then obviously, you know, Supreme Leader Ren is kind of a maneuver that I don't hate. I have some gripes about the way that they choose to deploy and use his helmet moving forward. It's weird that he ever took it off. I think it really detracts from his arc at the end of the next movie. But yeah, it works. Like this, if this is your first time seeing it, this twist works really well. And yeah, you're right. That's interesting that it's the same scene. It's a little on the nose, maybe, to do it right before, but it is pretty interesting. Maybe it would have been cooler to see some kind of setup a little bit earlier. Like maybe we see Rey practicing this maneuver or something. Like give me a bit of setup for this. Because we know as fans this is possible, but it comes back to what we were talking about before. How does Rey know this is a maneuver that you can do? I guess she's just seen Ben do it, right?
Yeah, I mean,
and how does Ben know to do it? He's Jedi trained. So like there's an extent to which it kind of explains itself if you think about it in the right framing. But it doesn't ring true for Rey to particularly know that in that moment. I guess it is really top of her mind though. I really haven't thought about that.
I mean, one thing is that you could argue that she knew that it was possible because in the end of The Force Awakens, when she pulled the saber out of the snow to her, that's the same action as throwing it. So she knows that the blade won't just magically activate when it's flying through the air, and that she could reach out her hand and she can grab it. So you could say that she was thinking about that when she threw it to him. But the thing that I keep thinking about is the action of the throw bugs the stew out of me. Because all she had to do was hold it out in her hand, just flat in her hand, and then Kylo force pulls it to him. Then it would have been linear in a straight line, and it wouldn't have been flipping like this, where he had to catch it absolutely perfectly, or it would be backwards, or it would be upside down, or whatever. Like, the manner in which it was thrown made it very, like, his chance of death, like, skyrocketed, versus if she had just let him force pull it to himself, and she just offered it, and he force pulls it.
I gotta see this in slow motion now. So he's stuck, and then... Yeah, you might be right. It is kind of a crazy toss.
Yeah, and like look how it lands into his hand, because it actually lands like his hand is down and it lands like upside down into it. It's the weirdest. It's the weirdest motion, and then everyone gripes about the fact that he like doesn't hit the power button. Yeah. But we could. I mean, that's really hard. I mean, as a filmmaker, I'll let that slide because choreographing that.
Yeah, someone on set was job is to pick that up. That's not the movie's fault. Yeah, you're right. She just fucking hawks it. Mm-hmm. Like she's just watched Supreme Leader Snoke, like, because she tries to grab the saber and then he like makes it go around her and then it hits her on the back of the head. She just watched someone have a lot of tremendous control in moving a saber. Why doesn't she like force get it over there? I love that her instinct is I'll just peg it at him and then hope that and then the question is Kylo using the Force to make it land correctly? The answer is that's the only way this makes any sense whatsoever.
We come back to that argument a lot to defend these.
Okay. They are precognitive sci-fi wizards. So at a certain point, criticism becomes like yo, stop it. It's fine. Don't worry about it, man. I always think about, when I think about this stuff, and we'll definitely cover this moment at some point, I think about the moment in the Clone Wars it's Attack of the Clones is what the second movie is called. Jesus. Attack of the Clones, where Obi-Wan is knocked down and he tosses Anakin his saber, and he's got two sabers. The way that Obi-Wan throws it is it doesn't spin in the air.
Yeah, it's like an underhanded, I think it's an underhanded toss or something where it's very like vertical up to him and he doesn't have to worry about how he's going to grab it. Like that makes perfect sense.
Yes, because Obi-Wan knows what he's doing. And so to me, Rey just absolutely pegging it is totally my move as well, because I'm an idiot. I'd be like, well, he needs the sword. How else am I going to get it to him? Doesn't think because an underhand toss in this moment would have worked as well. You could have just like really like kind of flipped it up to him, you know, and it would have been like, and then he could have caught it and done it. But no, it's this like overarm, like it's like she's out here like fielding on a baseball from like way out back. She's just really getting it in there. And there's an extent to which that works for me because she doesn't know what she's... actually, the scene transition's interesting. So when she throws it, it then cuts to the close-up and then it's not flipping. It just lands. It like comes in and lands in his hand. So it's clear that she's thrown it and then they've cut and then they've been like, okay, 3, 2, 1, and then he just dropped it into his hand. I want to see the outtakes where they didn't do that and it was just her throwing it at him and just like him trying to catch it, like 100 takes of that, like of just like trying to get it right, and then eventually he catches it and they're like, did we get it? Did we get it? It's like, oh, the camera wasn't recording. Like give me that moment.
I mean, watch it be that like they actually tried to do something like that, because it always blows me away to find out that some stuff that you thought had to have been fake somehow was actually like on set real
like legit
movie magic. Yeah, like I always remember back to the first Spider-Man movie where they're in the cafeteria and he catches
tray?
all that stuff on his tray. Like legit took them like 100 takes to do it.
Yeah, they just made Tobey Maguire do that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's beautiful. I mean,
it's so convincing as well because they actually did it, and it's so great. I mean, just the funniest thing about that is imagine being Kirsten Dunst in that scene.
I was just thinking that like her reaction is real. She's like, "You got it, you did it."
She's like, "Holy shit! Oh my god!"
She's like, "I've been falling into your arms for the past 4 hours, and you finally caught the food."
That's so. And apparently, Tobey Maguire is like historically a bit of an asshole. So I could only imagine how irritating this would have been to be her in this scene. Like just during this filming of this guy that you don't particularly like, who's your co-star, just like catching you like 75 times in a day, trying to do this thing. And like, I bet you there are scenes where like the milk lands wrong and it like falls off and like spills on her and shit, because they put like water and stuff in it. They made sure it wasn't weighted correctly, so it looked realistic. Like just don't you don't have to do that, guys. We get CG now. It's fine. You don't have to do that. Back then, why not? Let's do it. And there's a lot of stuff in The Mandalorian that's like that as well, where they just did it because they were like, well, there's no reason not to. We can do it to the best of our ability, then like tweak it in post. And there's an extent to which you feel it in that show, and you feel that there's a tactileness to that show, even though a lot of it is filmed on that big like projected screeny, the big thing. The thing. You guys know what I'm talking about. The big Star Wars Disney technology thing where they project the stuff and it's all 3D mapped and it's how they get all the reflections and stuff right. Even though most of it's there and not on a soundstage, a lot of the action they're trying to do for real, and they're actually like, making a stunt guy or Pedro Pascal get hit in the head. Like, they're just doing it. And you can really feel that coming through. But equally, you can feel it coming through in this scene where there's not enough practice for the actually doing it to feel right. And so it's interesting the way that this kind of threads the needle between not being improvised enough to feel scrappy and not being practiced enough to feel real and threatening. And it like gets the worst of both worlds somehow. And I think that's honestly like the worst crime about this particular moment is it kind of reveals writ large that there is this transition about to happen toward this other genre, and they kind of had to force it in somewhere. Pun not intended. Can you add like a snare drum hit, please?